April 29th, 1975, 03:45 hours, Eastern Mediterranean Sea, approximately 120 nautical miles southeast of Crete. Captain Second Rank Yuri Vasilievich Andropov pressed his forehead against the cool metal of the periscope housing, feeling the familiar vibration of the Project 671 nuclear submarine's reactor thrumming through the steel beneath his feet. For 6 days now, his Victor-class submarine had maintained station in these waters, cycling between depths of 150 and 200 meters, waiting for the intelligence reports from Moscow to materialize into something tangible. The message had been brief and cryptic, as they always were. American carrier strike group transiting eastward. Observe and report capabilities. Do not engage. Maintain covert surveillance. Andropov had been tracking American surface vessels for nearly 11 years now, ever since his first patrol as a junior officer aboard an old diesel boat during the Cuban crisis. Back then, he had believed what the political officers told them, what the newspapers from Moscow proclaimed with absolute certainty. The Americans were paper tigers, their military a facade of impressive-looking ships that lacked the revolutionary spirit of the Soviet Navy. The imperialist forces were technologically backward, reliant on outdated World War II designs with fresh paint and new names. He had believed it all, every word. That was before he actually saw them operate. The sonar operator, a young Michman named Konstantin, turned from his station with wide eyes. "Captain, I have multiple contacts bearing 090, range approximately 40 kilometers. I count 6 surface contacts, sir. Possible submarine contact as well, but signature is extremely faint." Andropov moved swiftly to the sonar station, placing his hand on the young man's shoulder as he leaned in to examine the waterfall display. The phosphorescent green lines cascading down the screen told a story that made his stomach tighten with the old familiar tension. 6 surface ships. That meant a full American carrier battle group. And somewhere in that formation would be the primary target, the vessel that Moscow wanted documented with every sensor his submarine possessed. An American nuclear aircraft carrier. "Bring us to periscope depth," Andropov ordered. "Slowly. 5 degrees up angle. Maintain speed at 4 knots." The submarine tilted gently upward, and Andropov felt his weight shift slightly backward as the deck inclined beneath him. They had drilled this maneuver thousands of times, but it never stopped being the most dangerous moment in submarine operations. Every time they came shallow, they risked detection. Every time they raised a mast above the surface, they painted a target on themselves for American radar and sonar operators who were, despite what the propaganda said, disturbingly good at their jobs. The periscope broke the surface, and Andropov rotated slowly, scanning the horizon. Dawn was still an hour away, and the Mediterranean was a dark mirror broken only by whitecaps. Then he saw them. Even at this distance, even in the pre-dawn darkness, the American formation was impossible to miss. The carrier was at the center naturally, surrounded by a protective screen of escorts in a perfect circular formation that spoke of long practice and absolute coordination. Andropov could see the lights of the ships, the distinctive pattern of their running lights, the way they maintained precise intervals even while moving at speed. "Target acquired," he said quietly. "Range to carrier approximately 38 kilometers. Bearing 090. I want tracking solutions on all contacts. Communications, prepare to copy. I will be dictating observations for immediate transmission to Northern Fleet Command." He kept his eye pressed to the periscope, adjusting the magnification. The carrier was massive. Even at this distance, it dominated the seascape like a floating city. Andropov had seen American carriers before, but never this clearly, never for this long. The intelligence briefings had mentioned that one of America's nuclear carriers might be operating in the Mediterranean. USS Enterprise, they had said, the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier in the world. 8 nuclear reactors, unlimited range, capable of speeds exceeding 30 knots, air wing of 90 aircraft. The numbers in the briefing had seemed exaggerated, the typical American boasting that characterized so much of their military propaganda. Andropov had mentally reduced them by about 30%, applying what he thought was reasonable Soviet skepticism. Now, watching the massive vessel cut through the Mediterranean swells without any visible effort, maintaining speed that would require his own nuclear submarine to push its reactors hard, he realized that the intelligence briefings had not exaggerated at all. If anything, they had understated the reality. "Captain, contact is definitely USS Enterprise," his executive officer reported, having consulted the recognition manual. "Profile matches exactly. Length approximately 342 meters, displacement approximately 94,000 tons, fully loaded. That is confirmed as the world's first nuclear carrier." Andropov nodded, not taking his eye from the periscope. 94,000 tons, his entire submarine displaced barely 5,000 tons submerged. The American carrier outweighed his command by a factor of nearly 20 to 1. It was a floating airbase, a mobile projection of American power that could steam anywhere in the world's oceans without refueling, without resupply, carrying enough aircraft to match the entire air force of a small nation. "I count 4 escorts visible," Andropov continued his narration. "2 cruisers port and starboard of the carrier, approximately 4,000 meters offset. 2 destroyers, 1 leading, 1 trailing. The formation is maintaining precise station keeping. Speed is estimated at 25 knots. Weather is calm, sea state 3, wind from the northwest at 15 knots. He paused, adjusting the focus, and what he saw next made his breath catch in his throat. The Enterprise's flight deck was alive with activity. Even in the darkness, he could see the navigation lights of aircraft being positioned, the glow of the deck lighting, the purposeful movement of dozens of small figures that he knew were American flight deck personnel preparing for operations. At 25 knots, in darkness, in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. "They are preparing flight operations," Andropov said quietly. "At night, while underway at high speed." His executive officer moved closer, his voice equally low. "Captain, that seems extremely dangerous. Surely no Air Force would risk aircraft operations in these conditions." Andropov said nothing. He had read the reports. He had seen the intelligence assessments. The Americans had been conducting night carrier operations since 1944 during their island-hopping campaign against Japan. They had been doing it for 30 years. They were good at it. And the fact that they were preparing to launch aircraft now in pre-dawn darkness, while steaming at 25 knots through open ocean, spoke to a level of operational capability that made his earlier confidence seem childishly naive. Communications, add to the report. "Target is preparing flight operations in hours of darkness, conditions poor visibility, carrier maintaining high speed throughout preparation. This demonstrates operational capability far exceeding previous intelligence estimates." He rotated the periscope slowly, taking in the entire formation. The escorts were positioned in a perfect defensive screen, their radars no doubt sweeping the sky and sea constantly. The Americans called it a carrier battle group, and now Andropov understood why. This was not simply a collection of ships sailing together. This was an integrated weapons system, a floating fortress designed to project power and defend itself against any conceivable threat. Each escort carried missiles, guns, torpedoes, helicopters. Each one was linked by radio and data link to the carrier and to every other ship in the formation. They operated as a single organism, responsive and coordinated. "Sonar, what is the status of that possible submarine contact?" Constantine shook his head. "Lost it, Captain. If it was there, it is too quiet for me to maintain contact. Signature was barely above ambient noise level." Of course it was. The Americans would have at least one attack submarine screening the carrier, probably one of their Los Angeles-class boats. Fast, quiet, deadly. Designed specifically to hunt and kill Soviet submarines like his own. Andropov had to assume they were being tracked right now. He had to assume that somewhere in the dark water ahead, An American submarine commander was watching his boat on sonar, calculating firing solutions, waiting for orders that might or might not come. Down periscope, take us to 180 meters, maintain contact on passive sonar only. The deck tilted forward as the submarine descended back into the safer depths. Andropov moved to the plotting table where his executive officer had begun marking the American formation on the chart. The Enterprise was heading almost due east toward the Suez Canal and the Indian Ocean beyond. That meant they were likely heading to Southeast Asia, to the waters off Vietnam, where the American presence was collapsing in spectacular fashion. Saigon was falling. The Americans were evacuating their embassy. And here was one of their largest carriers steaming toward the crisis at high speed, preparing to launch combat operations. "They are not withdrawing," Andropov said aloud, though he was speaking more to himself than to anyone else. "We have been told for weeks that the Americans are defeated in Vietnam, that they are running away with their tails between their legs. But this ship, this formation, they are not running. They are operating." His executive officer looked up from the chart. "Captain?" Andropov shook his head. "Continue tracking. I want passive sonar contact maintained at all times. Communications, prepare to transmit full contact report to Fleet Command via burst transmission. Include all observational data, ship identifications, course, speed, composition of battle group. And include my assessment that American operational capability exceeds previous intelligence estimates by significant margin." Over the next 4 hours, as dawn broke over the Mediterranean and USS Enterprise continued eastward, Andropov's crew maintained watch. They tracked the carrier group using passive sonar, staying deep, moving slowly, doing everything possible to remain undetected. And as they tracked, they gathered data that would become one of the most detailed surveillance reports ever filed by a Soviet submarine on American carrier operations. What Andropov observed during those 4 hours would, years later, become required reading at Soviet naval academies as an example of honest tactical assessment in the face of uncomfortable realities. At 06:15 hours, Enterprise turned into the wind and began launching aircraft. Andropov brought the submarine to periscope depth again, risking detection for the chance to observe what came next. Through the periscope, he watched as the massive carrier's catapults began hurling aircraft into the sky at intervals of less than 90 seconds. The sound carried across the water even at their distance of 30 kilometers, a thunderous whoosh followed by the roar of jet engines at full power. The first aircraft to launch were fighters. Andropov recognized them from the intelligence briefings as F-14 Tomcats, America's newest carrier fighter. They had entered service just the previous year, and this was apparently their first operational deployment to a combat zone. Two-seat twin-engine fighters capable of speeds exceeding Mach 2, equipped with long-range radar and Phoenix missiles that could engage targets at ranges up to 160 kilometers. The Soviet Navy had nothing comparable. The MiG-23 was a capable fighter, but it lacked the Tomcat's long-range intercept capability, its powerful radar, its ability to engage multiple targets simultaneously. The Tomcats launched in pairs, one from each of Enterprise's bow catapults, and immediately climbed into combat air patrol stations above and ahead of the carrier. Within 20 minutes, Andropov counted 8 Tomcats in the air, forming a protective bubble around the battle group that extended outward for hundreds of kilometers. Then came the attack aircraft. A-6 Intruders, twin-engine, all-weather attack jets capable of carrying enormous weapons loads over considerable distances. A-7 Corsairs, smaller single-engine attack aircraft optimized for close air support. S-3 Vikings, specialized anti-submarine warfare aircraft that could hunt and kill submarines using sophisticated sensors and torpedoes. E-2 Hawkeyes, radar early warning aircraft that could detect threats at extreme ranges and coordinate the defensive fighter screen. The variety was staggering. The operational tempo was breathtaking. Within an hour, Enterprise had launched more than 40 aircraft, cycling them off the deck with mechanical precision, never pausing, never slowing. The carrier continued steaming at high speed throughout the launch operations. never wavering from course, the escorts maintaining perfect formation around it. They have put more aircraft in the air in 1 hour than our entire Baltic fleet could launch in a day, Andropov said quietly to his executive officer. And they are doing it while moving at high speed in open ocean, with no ground-based support, no nearby airfields, nothing but this one ship and its escorts. His executive officer nodded slowly. The man was young, a true believer in Soviet superiority, but even he could not argue with what they were witnessing through the periscope. This was not propaganda. This was not American boasting. This was operational reality. Communications add to the report. Enterprise has launched 40-plus aircraft in approximately 60 minutes. Launch cycle is continuous, with aircraft leaving the deck at intervals of 60 to 90 seconds. No apparent mechanical difficulties. All aircraft successfully airborne. The carrier has maintained speed and course throughout launch operations. Escort formation has not wavered. This demonstrates operational proficiency and mechanical reliability that exceeds all previous intelligence assessments. Andropov lowered the periscope and moved back to the plotting table. On the chart, the Enterprise's track was a straight line pointing towards Suez. Around that line, his navigator had drawn circles representing the combat radius of the various aircraft types they had observed. The F-14s could patrol hundreds of kilometers from the carrier. The A-6s could strike targets 800 kilometers away. The S-3s could hunt submarines in a vast circle around the battle group, and all of this from a single ship, a single vessel that could steam for years without refueling, that carried its own airfield, its own air force, its own defensive systems. The Soviet Navy had nothing like it. They had the Kiev-class carriers, but those were tiny by comparison, carrying only helicopters and vertical takeoff aircraft with limited range and payload. They had cruisers armed with missiles, submarines armed with torpedoes and cruise missiles, but nothing that could project air power across thousands of kilometers from a mobile platform that was itself nearly invulnerable to conventional attack. Captain, sonar contact on possible submarine bearing 045, range approximately 15 kilometers. Andropov moved swiftly back to the sonar station. Classification? Unknown, sir. Signature is extremely faint. Possible Los Angeles class attack submarine based on acoustic profile, but confidence is low. Maintain tracking, helm, come left to course 270. Reduce speed to 3 knots. Rig for ultra quiet. If there was an American attack submarine out there and Andropov had to assume there was, then his position was potentially compromised. The Americans had sophisticated sonar systems far better than anything the Soviet Navy possessed. They could detect submarines at ranges that Soviet commanders found difficult to believe, and if they knew he was here, they could hunt him, track him, even attack him if orders came from their command. The submarine turned slowly, its reactor power reduced to minimum. Every non-essential system shut down or muffled. The crew moved through the boat in their soft rubber shoes, speaking in whispers, avoiding any noise that might carry through the hull and betray their position. This was the game they played, hunter and hunted, each side trying to hear the other while remaining silent themselves. For 2 hours, they drifted slowly southwest, moving away from the Enterprise battle group, descending to 220 meters using water temperature layers to mask their presence. The sonar operators reported intermittent contacts, possible American submarine moving in a search pattern, but nothing definitive. Finally, Andropov judged them clear enough to come shallow again and raise the radio mast for transmission to Fleet Command. The burst transmission lasted less than 2 seconds, a compressed package of data that shot skyward to a Soviet communications satellite and then down to Northern Fleet headquarters in Severomorsk. In those 2 seconds, Andropov transmitted everything his submarine had observed, every measurement, every count, every assessment. And he included his own conclusions, the professional judgment of a submarine commander with 11 years of experience tracking American naval forces. The American Carrier Strike Group represented a capability that Soviet forces could not match and could not effectively counter. The Enterprise alone carried more combat power than an entire Soviet naval task force, Its operational tempo, its mechanical reliability, its coordination with escort vessels, its ability to conduct continuous around-the-clock operations while steaming at high speed, all demonstrated a level of naval proficiency that exceeded Soviet capabilities by a significant margin. It was not what Moscow wanted to hear, but it was the truth. 3 days later, after maintaining distant tracking of the Enterprise group as it transited through the Suez Canal and entered the Red Sea, Andropov received new orders. Return to base. Comprehensive debriefing required. Report in person to Northern Fleet Intelligence Directorate. And then a final line that made him go cold. Do not discuss observations with crew. Classification highest level, they knew. The command structure knew that his report contradicted the official narrative, that his observations painted a picture of American capability that made Soviet claims of naval superiority look foolish, and they wanted to control the information, to brief him on what he could and could not say, to ensure that his first-hand experience did not undermine the propaganda that kept the Soviet military-industrial complex funded and the population confident in their national defense. The voyage back to Severomorsk took 12 days. During that time, Andropov spent hours in his tiny captain's cabin, writing and rewriting his formal report, trying to find language that conveyed the reality of what he had witnessed without sounding defeatist or disloyal. It was a difficult balance. The Soviet system valued political reliability as much as professional competence, and a commander who expressed too much admiration for enemy capabilities could find his career ended quickly. But Andropov had always prided himself on honesty. He had always believed that accurate intelligence was more valuable than comforting lies. And what he had seen tracking USS Enterprise was something that Soviet naval commanders needed to understand, even if it made them uncomfortable. When they finally arrived at Severomorsk, Andropov was met at the dock by a security detail and driven directly to Northern Fleet headquarters. He was not allowed to return to his apartment. He was not allowed to speak with other submarine commanders. He was taken to a conference room deep in the headquarters building, where 3 admirals and half a dozen intelligence officers were waiting. The debriefing lasted for 6 hours. They went through every detail of his surveillance mission, every observation, every measurement. They questioned his identification of the American vessels. They challenged his estimates of aircraft launch rates and operational tempo. They asked pointed questions about whether he might have been deceived by American deception measures, whether he might have misidentified ships or aircraft, whether his conclusions might be influenced by excessive respect for enemy capabilities. Andropov answered every question with calm precision. He had decades of experience to draw upon. He had tracked American carriers before, observed their operations, studied their capabilities, and he knew what he had seen. USS Enterprise was exactly what the intelligence reports claimed, and probably more capable than even those reports suggested. The American Carrier Strike Group was a weapons system of extraordinary power and flexibility, operated with a level of proficiency that Soviet forces could not currently match. The admirals were not pleased. One of them, a political officer whose chest was covered in decorations that seemed to have nothing to do with actual naval service, accused Andropov of defeatism, of allowing himself to be intimidated by the American propaganda machine. The Soviet Navy, this officer insisted, was superior to the American fleet in every meaningful category. Soviet submarines were quieter, Soviet missiles were more powerful, Soviet tactical doctrine was more advanced. The idea that a single American carrier could outmatch Soviet naval forces was bourgeois nonsense designed to undermine socialist confidence. Andropov sat silently through the tirade, his face expressionless. He had heard it all before. Every submarine commander who had ever filed an honest assessment of American capabilities had heard some version of this speech. The political officers lived in a fantasy world where Soviet equipment was always superior. Soviet training was always better. Soviet tactics were always more advanced. Reality was not permitted to intrude on this fantasy. But one of the other admirals, a fleet commander with actual operational experience, asked the question that mattered. Captain Andropov, if war had broken out while you were tracking this American formation and you had been ordered to attack, what would have been your chances of success? Andropov met the Admiral's eyes. Against the carrier itself? Minimal, sir. The defensive screen was too tight, the escorts too alert, the anti-submarine warfare capability too sophisticated. I would have had one opportunity for a firing solution. Perhaps two torpedoes launched before the American attack submarine located and destroyed my boat. The chances of those torpedoes penetrating the defensive screen and striking the carrier are very low, less than 20% by my estimate, and the probability of my submarine surviving the engagement is nearly zero. The room went silent. This was not the answer anyone wanted to hear. But it was the truth, and everyone in the room with actual naval experience knew it. The Admiral nodded slowly. And if you had 4 submarines? A coordinated Wolfpack attack? Better odds, sir. Perhaps 40% chance of damaging the carrier. But we would lose all 4 submarines in the attempt. The Americans have extensive anti-submarine capability, both from their attack submarines and from their carrier-based S-3 aircraft. They train constantly for multi-submarine attack scenarios. They are prepared for it. And their nuclear submarines are faster than ours, quieter than ours, and equipped with better sonar. In a sustained engagement, they would hunt us down one by one. The silence stretched longer. Finally, the fleet commander spoke again. Your report will be classified at the highest level. You will not discuss your observations with anyone outside this room. Your crew will be individually debriefed and instructed on security protocols. Do you understand? Captain? I understand, sir. You are a good officer, Andropov, one of our best submarine commanders. But you must understand that operational intelligence is only one factor in strategic planning. There are political considerations, economic factors, morale issues. The information you have gathered is valuable, but it must be contextualized properly. Translation: they were going to bury it. They would file his report in some secure archive where it would never see daylight, never inform actual planning, never influence the propaganda that told Soviet citizens their navy was the most powerful in the world. Andropov understood. He had always understood, but that did not make it any less frustrating. He was dismissed from the debriefing and spent the next week in mandatory political education sessions where he was lectured on the importance of maintaining appropriate socialist perspective in intelligence assessments. He listened patiently, signed the required documents, promised to maintain operational security. And then, he returned to his submarine and prepared for the next patrol. But something had changed. Andropov had always been a loyal Soviet officer, committed to his service, believing in the cause even when he doubted the methods. Now, after tracking USS Enterprise, after seeing the immense gulf between American capability and Soviet boasting, after watching his honest professional assessment get buried for political reasons, he found himself questioning things he had never questioned before. The Soviet Union was not as strong as it claimed. The Americans were not the declining imperial power that Pravda described. And the gap between propaganda and reality was not narrowing, it was widening. Every year, the Americans built better ships, developed better technology, trained more effectively. Every year, the Soviet Union spent more money, built more weapons, deployed more forces, but fell further behind in the categories that actually mattered. Andropov was not alone in this realization. Over the next decade, he would encounter other submarine commanders, other naval officers, who had reached similar conclusions based on their own observations. They spoke carefully in private, using vague language that could not be construed as disloyal. But they all understood the fundamental reality. The Soviet Navy was not prepared to fight the U.S. Navy in a sustained conflict. The technological gap was too great, the operational proficiency too different, the industrial capacity too mismatched. This understanding spread slowly through the submarine service, passed from commander to commander, in quiet conversations over glasses of vodka in secure apartments. It created a subculture of realism within the Soviet Navy, officers who understood the truth even as they publicly supported the official narrative. And it created a sense of frustration and futility that contributed years later to the collapse of morale that would help bring down the entire Soviet system. But in 1975, as Andropov prepared for his next patrol, these future developments were not yet visible. He knew only that he had seen something important, filed a report that told the truth, and watched that truth get buried for political convenience. It was, he thought bitterly, a perfectly Soviet outcome. USS Enterprise continued its deployment to Southeast Asia, where its aircraft flew cover for the final evacuation of Saigon in Operation Frequent Wind. The carrier launched 95 sorties over the course of that operation, providing air cover for the helicopters that lifted thousands of Americans and South Vietnamese from the collapsing city. It was a humiliating withdrawal from a lost war, but the military operation itself was executed with precision and professionalism. Not a single American aircraft was lost to enemy action during the evacuation. Soviet observers watching from a distance noted the operational efficiency even in retreat. American forces might have lost the political war in Vietnam, but their military capability remained formidable. This was the message that officers like Andropov had been trying to convey to their superiors for years. The Americans were not defeated. They were not demoralized. They were not in decline. They had lost a political struggle in a peripheral theater, but their core military capability remained intact and, in many ways, was growing stronger. The report that Captain Andropov filed after tracking USS Enterprise through the Mediterranean eventually found its way to the desk of Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the commander-in-chief of the Soviet Navy. Gorshkov, unlike the political officers who had initially questioned Andropov's assessment, understood exactly what the report meant. He had been arguing for years that the Soviet Union needed to develop its own nuclear carrier capability, that submarine-based naval strategy alone could not counter American carrier battle groups. Andropov's detailed observations provided concrete evidence for this argument. But even Gorshkov's influence was not enough to overcome the economic and political realities of the Soviet system. Nuclear carriers were expensive. They required massive industrial investment, specialized shipyards, trained personnel, decades of development. The Soviet economy was already straining under the burden of military expenditures. The political leadership was unwilling to commit the resources necessary to match American carrier capability. Instead, they invested in submarines, cruise missiles, long-range bombers, weapon systems that were cheaper to produce and maintain, but could not provide the same strategic flexibility as carriers. It was a calculated gamble. Soviet strategic thinking held that in a war with NATO, their forces would not need to project power globally. They would need to destroy American carriers, sink their merchant marine, disrupt their sea lines of communication. Submarines and missiles could accomplish those missions without the expense and complexity of carrier operations. It was a defensive, reactive strategy based on the assumption that the Soviet Union would fight a short, intense war rather than a prolonged global conflict. The problem with this strategy was that it ceded strategic initiative to the Americans. It meant that Soviet forces could react to American moves but could not effectively project power into areas where the U.S. Navy did not choose to operate. It meant that the Soviet Union could threaten American naval forces, but could not protect its own allies or interests with the same flexibility. And it meant that in any crisis situation, American carriers could arrive on scene with overwhelming power, while Soviet forces struggled to assemble a response. Captain Andropov understood all of this. He was not a strategic planner or a political theorist, but he was a practical submarine commander who understood operational realities. And the operational reality was that tracking USS Enterprise had been like tracking a force of nature. The carrier was so large, so powerful, so well protected that attacking it successfully would require resources and coordination that the Soviet Navy could barely imagine deploying. He wrote one final assessment, classified at his own initiative as top secret, that he placed in his personal safe rather than submitting through official channels. In this document, he laid out his conclusions with brutal honesty. The Soviet Navy could not effectively counter American carrier strike groups with current technology and tactics. Any attempt to engage them would result in catastrophic losses for Soviet submarine forces. The strategic balance at sea favored the Americans decisively, and this advantage would only grow more pronounced over time unless the Soviet Union made fundamental changes to its naval strategy and industrial priorities. This assessment never reached the admirals who needed to read it. Andropov kept it locked away, a private record of professional judgment that he knew would end his career if it became public. But he showed it to a few trusted colleagues, other submarine commanders who had reached similar conclusions, and they read it with grim recognition. They all knew the truth. They all understood the reality beneath the propaganda. They just did not have the power to change anything. Years later, after the Soviet Union had collapsed and the Cold War had ended, researchers discovered Andropov's report in newly opened archives. It was published in a Russian naval journal along with several other similar assessments from Soviet submarine commanders. Western analysts read it with interest, noting how accurately Andropov had assessed American capabilities and how clearly he had seen the weaknesses in Soviet naval strategy. One American naval historian wrote that documents like Andropov's report demonstrated that the Soviet Navy was not blind to American advantages. They had capable officers who understood operational realities and could make accurate assessments. The problem was not intelligence failure. The problem was that the Soviet political and economic system could not respond effectively to that intelligence. The truth was available, but the truth was not convenient, and so it was filed away rather than acted upon. Captain Andropov retired from the Soviet Navy in 1989, just before the system he had served for 3 decades collapsed entirely. He lived long enough to see Russia become a different kind of country, one where speaking honestly about American military capability would not end a career. He was interviewed in the late 1990s by a Russian television crew making a documentary about the Cold War at sea. They asked him what he remembered most about his years tracking American carriers. He thought for a long moment before answering. "I remember thinking that we were lying to ourselves," he said quietly. "Not about everything. We had good submarines, good crews, good tactics for certain missions. But when it came to carrier operations, to projecting power across oceans, to sustained naval operations far from home bases, the Americans were in a completely different league. And we pretended not to see it. We filed reports that told the truth, and those reports disappeared into classified archives, and the propaganda machine kept telling everyone we were superior. It was madness. Expensive, dangerous madness." The interview was broadcast once and then quietly shelved. Even in post-Soviet Russia, there was apparently limited appetite for honest discussion of Cold War realities. USS Enterprise served for 51 years, longer than any carrier in U.S. Navy history. During that time, it deployed to combat zones around the world, participated in operations from Vietnam to Iraq, served as a test platform for new technologies and tactics, and trained thousands of naval aviators who would go on to command their own carriers. It was finally decommissioned in 2012 and is currently being slowly dismantled, its 8 nuclear reactors defueled, its massive hull cut apart. But during those 51 years of service, Enterprise represented something more than just a ship. It represented American industrial capacity, American technological sophistication, American strategic reach. It represented a level of military capability that Soviet forces could observe but never quite match. And it represented the practical reality beneath all the Cold War rhetoric about strategic balance and military parity. The balance was not equal. The parity was not real. One side had capabilities that the other side could not effectively counter, and all the propaganda in the world could not change that fact. Captain Andropov knew this in 1975, watching through his periscope as Enterprise launched aircraft into the dawn sky. His superiors knew it but could not admit it. The political leadership knew it but could not act on it. And eventually, The accumulated weight of all these uncomfortable truths, all these gaps between propaganda and reality, helped bring down the entire system. The Soviet submarine that tracked USS Enterprise filed a terrifying report. Not because it described some new American superweapon or unexpected tactical capability. The report was terrifying because it described, with professional precision and undeniable evidence, exactly how wide the gap between American and Soviet naval capability had become. And it was terrifying because everyone who read that report understood that closing that gap was probably impossible given the economic and political realities of the Soviet system. Sometimes the most frightening intelligence is not about enemy strengths you didn't know existed. Sometimes it is about your own weaknesses you had always suspected but never quite wanted to acknowledge. Captain Andropov's report forced that acknowledgement. And like so many uncomfortable truths in the Soviet system, it was classified, filed away, and effectively buried. But the truth does not disappear just because you stop looking at it. Eventually, reality demands acknowledgement. That lesson, more than any specific tactical detail in Andropov's report, is what makes the document significant. It is a case study in how institutional unwillingness to confront uncomfortable facts can undermine an entire strategic enterprise. The Soviet Navy had good intelligence about American capabilities. What it lacked was a political and economic system capable of responding effectively to that intelligence. Captain Andropov filed his report in April 1975. The Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991. Whether there is a direct connection between these events is debatable, but those who read Andropov's report and the dozens of similar assessments filed by other Soviet officers over the years understand that the system was eating itself from within long before the final collapse. The lies were too expensive to maintain. The gap between propaganda and reality was too wide to bridge, and officers like Andropov, loyal servants of the state who tried to tell the truth, were silenced for their honesty. That is perhaps the most terrifying finding of all.